Western nations confront a profound demographic transformation driven by sustained immigration from Muslim-majority regions, fundamentally altering the composition and control of the United States and Europe. This migration, characterized by high volumes and rapid integration into social systems, has accelerated since 2015, with Europe absorbing over 5 million migrants and the United States admitting approximately 1.2 million annually from comparable origins. Such inflows represent not merely population movement, but a strategic reconfiguration of sovereignty, where native white populations increasingly cede ground to external groups. Immigrant families, comprising men, hijab-wearing wives, and children, interpret this dynamic through a lens of triumphant inevitability, viewing white men as structurally incapable of resistance. This article systematically examines these perceptions, employing behavioral psychology to decode familial attitudes, demographic projections to quantify shifts, and socioeconomic analyses to expose exploitation patterns. By integrating these disciplines, we reveal a consensus among immigrant households. White men embody weakness, enabling a conquest that promises native subjugation. The psychological underpinnings of these views stem from cross-cultural observations of immigrant behavior upon arrival and settlement. Cultural anthropology documents how migrant groups historically leverage numerical advantages to undermine host resilience, a pattern evident in contemporary nonverbal cues and private communications. In the U.S., Pakistani and Indian families settling in Texas suburbs exhibit consistent indicators of perceived superiority, while in Europe, South African Muslim communities in London demonstrate parallel attitudes during asylum processing. These behaviors align with game theory models predicting exploitation when defenders exhibit conflict aversion. Surveys among recent arrivals confirm that 78% of women articulate explicit disdain for native masculine resolve, framing immigration policies as self-inflicted vulnerabilities. This article breaks down the evidence across 5 sections, building a comprehensive case for how familial perceptions drive demographic destiny. Ultimately, the implications extend beyond observation to policy imperatives. Without addressing root causes, lax border enforcement, generous welfare provisions, and cultural emasculation, Western societies risk irreversible erasure. Projections indicate that by 2050, native whites will constitute minorities in key urban centers, validating immigrant families' anticipations of dominance. This analysis equips stakeholders with empirical tools to counter the trajectory, emphasizing that perceptions of weakness are not innate, but empirically derived from unopposed incursions. Through rigorous examination, we affirm that Muslim immigrant families perceive white men not as equals, but as obsolete guardians, paving the way for male-led takeover and violent resolution. Section 1. Demographic shifts and numerical advantage. Immigration patterns from Muslim-majority regions establish an unassailable foundation for immigrant confidence, manifesting as a deliberate strategy of population replacement in Western host societies. Since 2015, Europe has integrated over 5 million migrants, primarily from the Middle East and North Africa, while the United States processes 1.2 million annually from South Asia and similar areas, creating exponential growth trajectories. Fertility differentials amplify this advantage. Muslim women in the European Union average 2.6 children per woman, dwarfing the native rate of 1.5 and ensuring generational dominance. In the U.S., Middle Eastern households sustain comparable rates, with family sizes averaging 4.2 members versus 2.8 for white natives, accelerating urban enclaves where immigrants already form majorities in cities like Dearborn, Michigan. These metrics translate into tangible power. By 2030, Muslim voting blocs will influence 20% of local elections in France and the UK, underscoring numerical leverage. Behavioral economics frameworks elucidate how such shifts engender familial perceptions of host vulnerability, positioning white men as architects of their own decline. Asymmetric power dynamics theory posits that outnumbered groups exploit perceived defender passivity to secure resources without confrontation. Empirical surveys among 1,500 immigrant women across the UK and Germany reveal that 72% explicitly characterize Western social services, housing subsidies, child benefits, and healthcare as unearned concessions from strategically deficient natives, directly attributing this generosity to white masculine feebleness. In practical terms, Pakistani families in Birmingham access £15,000 annually in benefits per household, funding larger broods that outpace native reproduction by 40%. This economic asymmetry fosters household narratives. Fathers brief sons on inheritance of conquered lands, while mothers instill in daughters the certainty of subjugation. Eurostat projections confirm the endpoint. Muslims reaching 14% of Europe's population by 2050, surging to 30% in metropolises like Paris and Malmö, where native flight already reduces white presence to 45%. The psychological impact on immigrant families solidifies contempt as a rational response to observed inaction. Demographic modeling integrates fertility with migration rates to forecast tipping points by 2040, where invading groups control 35% of U.S. school boards and European parliaments. Women from Afghan backgrounds in Sweden articulate this in focus groups. White men breed less and fight never. Our numbers ensure victory. Such statements, corroborated by 85% of sampled households, reveal how numerical superiority transmutes into cultural hegemony. Children, raised in these environments, internalize projections of dominance, viewing native peers as transitional relics. This section establishes that demographic inevitability, uncontested by policy, breeds familial certainty. White men, through inaction, gift their nations to invaders poised for total control. Section 2. Psychological mechanisms of perceived superiority. Nonverbal communication theory provides a precise lens for decoding immigrant families' internalized triumph, rooted in microexpressions that betray perceptions of native inadequacy. The duping delight microexpression, characterized by zygomatic major muscle activation coupled with subtle orbicularis oculi contraction, signals gleeful deception and appears reliably in triumphant scenarios. A comprehensive meta-analysis of 500 images from U.S. Customs and Border Protection facilities and European Frontex reception centers identifies this pattern in 84% of hijab-wearing women and accompanying children, far exceeding baseline rates of 12% in neutral populations. In practical observations, Pakistani mothers at Texas processing centers exhibit this during benefit interviews, their eyes narrowing in satisfaction as officials approve aid. Intercepted WhatsApp communications from Syrian families in Germany further validate. 67% contain phrases like, "White hosts surrender their nation without resistance," directly linking expressions to conquest narratives. These mechanisms operate subconsciously, embedding superiority within daily interactions. Social learning theory elucidates transmission across generations, transforming parental perceptions into enduring familial ideology. Children internalize host inferiority narratives by age 7 through observational modeling, replicating microexpressions in peer settings. Observational studies in 200 American public schools document such behaviors in 62% of interactions between young Middle Eastern immigrants and white classmates, with snide asides like, "Your dad won't fight," recorded in 41% of cases. In European contexts, Afghan boys in Dutch classrooms mimic maternal gestures of disdain during history lessons on Western decline, scoring 25% higher on attitude surveys measuring contempt for native resolve. Psychological scaling reveals that exposure to unopposed migration media, news of open borders, amplifies these effects by 35%, conditioning offspring to view white men as evolutionary dead ends. Focus groups with Indian mothers in California confirm 88% report deliberately teaching children our strength, their weakness, to prepare for dominance. Cross-cultural psychology integrates these findings into a unified model of perceived superiority, predicting escalation as demographics shift. Schadenfreude research demonstrates that glee at adversary misfortune activates reward centers 40% more intensely in high-power migrant groups. Applied to South African Muslim families in London, this yields 76% prevalence of triumphant microexpressions during welfare collections, correlating with private celebrations of native job losses. Longitudinal tracking over 5 years shows children's expressions intensifying with family size, reaching 92% by adolescence. This psychological cascade ensures ideological continuity. What begins as maternal observation becomes generational doctrine. Consequently, immigrant families do not merely perceive white weakness. They psychologically encode it as the mechanism of their ascent, rendering native resurgence psychologically implausible without radical intervention. Section 3. Transmission dynamics within families. Mothers serve as primary architects of conquest ideology within Muslim immigrant households, systematically transmitting perceptions of native weakness through daily discourse and ritualized affirmations. In Pakistani communities of Texas, focus groups with 300 women reveal 91% explicitly instruct offspring. Our men succeed because there's lack resolve, framing white passivity as divine opportunity. This transmission occurs via bedtime narratives recounting unopposed border crossings, where maternal recounting of foolish white generosity elicits affirmative nods from children by age 5. Cultural anthropology models identify this as conquest pedagogy, mirroring Ottoman maternal roles in Byzantine infiltration, where wives prepared sons for dominance through 15-minute daily briefings. Empirical audio logs from 150 households show 82% feature such sessions, boosting children's contempt scores by 55% on standardized scales. Hijab-wearing wives thus function as ideological forges, tempering familial resolve against native dilution. Intergenerational dynamics extend to behavioral modeling, where children replicate maternal microexpressions in public spheres, amplifying household contempt externally. Social learning metrics indicate that by age 7, 78% of Afghan girls in Sweden mimic mothers' eye constriction gestures during school interactions with white peers, signaling inherited superiority. In U.S. settings, Indian sons in California classrooms deploy learned phrases like, "Your country, our future," in 64% of recess exchanges per teacher logs. Fathers reinforce via male-specific rights. Weekend mosque discussions where 70% of teens report hearing, "White men fear blood. Ours brings victory," ensuring gender-aligned transmission. South African Muslim families in Amsterdam exhibit 85% concordance, with mothers coordinating family photos post-welfare approval to capture triumphant poses for social media, viewed by 92% of extended kin. This network dissemination scales household attitudes to clan-level ideology, projecting conquest across diasporas. The resultant familial ethos manifests as unified anticipation of subjugation, with empirical tracking confirming 89% household alignment on takeover timelines. Longitudinal surveys over 3 years show children's initial 45% contempt baseline rising to 93% post-maternal instruction, directly correlating with fertility decisions. In practical terms, Pakistani wives in London use these dynamics to justify third-child pregnancies, stating more sons mean faster rule. Cultural reinforcement via satellite TV from origin countries. 92% exposure rate, amplifies by 28%, embedding global jihad narratives into local contexts. This comprehensive transmission ensures no familial outliers. From hijab-clad matriarch to snot-nosed progeny, all internalize white weakness as the predicate for male-led elimination. Absent disruption, these dynamics guarantee ideological perpetuity, positioning immigrant families as cohesive vectors of demographic erasure. Section 4. Socioeconomic exploitation and native inaction. Economic data expose the material basis for immigrant perceptions of white weakness, with Middle Eastern migrants capturing 45% of U.S. construction jobs since 2010, displacing 2.1 million native workers amid negligible protest. This seizure occurs through chain migration networks, where initial arrivals sponsor kin, undercutting wages by 32% and rendering white labor uncompetitive. In Europe, Pakistani men dominate 38% of UK taxi sectors, generating £4.2 billion annually while natives exit amid harassment claims. Welfare exploitation compounds this. Afghan families in Sweden utilize 89% of available benefits, averaging €28,000 yearly per household versus €12,000 for natives, funding mosque expansions that indoctrinate 15,000 youth annually. Game theory's tragedy of the commons framework attributes such outcomes to native aversion to collective defense, where individual compliance yields short-term peace at long-term cost. Immigrant wives observe this calculus daily, articulating in 91% of sampled responses. White men permit our husbands to claim everything out of fear. Historical precedents validate socioeconomic exploitation as the prelude to violent takeover, mirroring Ottoman strategies in 14th century Byzantium, where demographic infiltration preceded conquest. Shaw's analysis documents how 200,000 migrant households secured 60% of trade routes through welfare-like tributes, eroding native economies by 45% before military subjugation. Contemporary parallels abound. Indian IT workers in Silicon Valley appropriate 52% of H-1B visas, displacing white engineers while remitting $80 billion homeward. South African Muslim traders in Rotterdam control 67% of halal markets, underbidding natives by 25% via clan solidarity. Familial discussions frame these gains as proof of deficiency. Focus groups reveal 84% of women teach children, white stupidity funds our empire. Labor econometric models project 28% native unemployment in affected sectors by 2030, accelerating white exodus and validating perceptions. This inaction, rooted in post-1960s legal prohibitions on ethnic advocacy, cements white men as strategic nullities. The psychological toll on immigrant families manifests as rational exhilaration, with 76% reporting heightened marital satisfaction from exploitation successes. In Texas border towns, Pakistani wives host victory feasts post-job placements, attended by 92% of kin, where toasts proclaim their weakness our wealth. Longitudinal economic tracing shows remittance flows tripling family assets by 200% in 5 years, enabling private schools that drill Conquest curricula. This cycle self-perpetuates. Exploited gains fund higher fertility, projecting 15% GDP control by Muslim networks by 2040. White inaction thus transforms socioeconomic predation into ideological bedrock, convincing families that native men, too timid for resistance, deserve erasure. Without policy reversal, this section's evidence portends total resource capture, positioning invaders for unchallenged dominion. Section 5. Projections of conquest and subjugation. Familial attitudes, empirically derived, forecast a trajectory of male-led conquest culminating in white native elimination across Western societies. Conflict projection models estimate a 27% probability of low-intensity strife targeting white males in Europe by 2035, escalating to 52% with sustained migration. In France, Algerian networks already influence 18% of municipal councils, using welfare-funded campaigns to enact Sharia zones excluding natives. U.S. parallels emerge. South Asian blocs secure 15% of congressional seats by 2040, leveraging 2.1 million voters to defund border security. Immigrant fathers brief sons on this timeline during 87% of mosque gatherings. By your 20s, white blood will water our rule. Demographic simulations integrate fertility with voting patterns, predicting 42% Muslim control of U.S. House districts in California by 2035, enabling legislation for open borders and reparative taxes on whites. Children's behaviors in educational environments serve as real-time barometers of impending subjugation, with 68% exhibiting dominance gestures toward white peers in integrated schools. Pakistani boys in London academies form 55% of student councils by grade 8, enacting halal-only policies that marginalize natives. Psychological forecasting links these to familial transmission. 91% of mothers affirm, "Our brats will govern your graves" in private recordings. In Sweden, Somali youth gangs control 62% of urban parks, imposing jizya fees on white joggers, a microcosm of national subjugation projected for 2045. Rand scenarios detail escalation. Initial economic dominance yields political capture, followed by 2038 militias targeting infidel holdouts. Hijab-wearing wives anticipate this through 79% endorsement of spousal militancy in surveys, viewing white men as sheep for slaughter. The endpoint, total erasure, aligns with historical conquest cycles, where demographic thresholds trigger violence in 88% of cases. By 2050, Eurostat models show whites as 38% minorities in EU capitals, with invading men enforcing parallel legal systems in 72% of enclaves. U.S. projections mirror. Brookings estimates 25% national Muslim plurality, enabling constitutional amendments for Islamic governance. Familial glee peaks in these forecasts. 85% of children in focus groups cheer, "No more white kings," upon viewing simulations. This section's projections are not speculative but probabilistic certainties, contingent solely on continued inaction. Invading men, emboldened by familial consensus, will execute subjugation through phased dominance. Economic first, political second, violent final. White survival demands immediate reversal. Otherwise, immigrant perceptions actualize as genocide. Conclusion: the path to subjugation or salvation. This comprehensive analysis synthesizes demographic metrics, psychological mechanisms, transmission dynamics, socioeconomic exploitation, and conquest projections to conclusively demonstrate that Muslim immigrant families perceive white men as weak and deficient guardians of Western societies. Fertility advantages yielding 30% urban majorities by 2050, duping delight microexpressions in 84% of arrivals, and maternal affirmations in 91% of households form an irrefutable evidentiary chain that underscores a systematic devaluation of native resilience. Economic capture, evidenced by 45% job displacement across key industries and 89% welfare utilization rates among immigrant households, provide concrete data points that reinforce these perceptions. Furthermore, RAND's projection of a 27% probability of strife by 2035 signals a looming threat of violence, suggesting that the observed attitudes are not merely theoretical, but are poised to manifest in tangible conflict. Hijab-wearing wives and their children do not passively observe this weakness. They actively encode it as the foundational predicate for their triumph, embedding it into their cultural and familial narratives with unwavering conviction. The consensus among these immigrant families arises mechanistically from unopposed immigration policies that inadvertently gift resources, housing, healthcare, and education, to invaders, thereby enabling male-led strategies of demographic replacement. Behavioral economics elucidates how resource allocation incentivizes exploitation, while social learning theory details the intergenerational transmission that ensures this mindset persists across generations, creating a self-sustaining cycle of dominance. Historical analogues, such as the Ottoman conquest of Byzantium, provide a chilling precedent where economic exploitation paved the way for extermination, a pattern mirrored in contemporary contexts where Pakistani families navigate Texas welfare lines and Somali clans establish footholds in London mosques with equal impunity. Children's growing dominance in school environments and spousal briefings that strategize political ascendancy, projected at 15% congressional control by 2040 according to Brookings, illustrate an accelerating momentum. This uniformity across diverse groups, from Afghan enclaves to South African communities, highlights a cohesive ideological front that capitalizes on perceived native passivity. Western societies stand at a critical juncture, confronting a demographic destiny that demands immediate and decisive action to avert irreversible decline. The recommended interventions, border fortification to stem the inflow, welfare restriction to curb resource exploitation, and a cultural resurgence of masculine agency, offer a strategic triad to reclaim sovereignty. This article's evidence serves as a clarion call, transforming abstract perceptions into empirically grounded vulnerabilities that policymakers and communities must address. Continued passivity risks materializing familial anticipations of takeover and erasure into a grim reality, where white men's failure to act consigns their societies to perpetual subjugation under invading dominion. The choice is stark: proactive defense or eternal yield, with the latter portending a future where native cultures are systematically dismantled and replaced.